Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the political climate leading up to World War II. As we were considering the topic of the course, we thought that in understanding the reasons for and ramifications of World War II and the creation of a Jewish state, it's important to consider the ideologies at work and the massive shift in world politics and economic structures leading up to this era. Of course, this is a huge and complex topic, but we hope that this can help to clarify some of the broad strokes. So I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about the origins of a few of the major philosophies that came into play in the 19th century. They would end up dramatically impacting world events through the Second World War, and these were socialism, communism, and fascism. Socialism, as we've defined it here, is a socioeconomic system governed by the ideas of egalitarianism or equality and controlled by the workers, either directly or indirectly. This means that the means of producing goods was owned not by individuals, but by the community or by the state on behalf of the community. The term socialism was first used sometime in the mid-19th century, but it's been attributed to several different thinkers. Socialist ideas, though, can be seen in literature and philosophy as far back as the work of Plato. Sir Thomas More's Utopia, written in 1516, was most likely an inspiration for later socialist philosophers. The rise in popularity of socialism in the early 19th century can most likely be attributed to excesses and abuses within capitalist systems at the time. Many writers criticized the poverty and inequality that came out of the Industrial Revolution, and they cast vision for small utopian communities and the equal redistribution of wealth. Communism was first conceived of by Karl Marx and his contemporaries. Sometimes called Marxism, communism is essentially just an extreme form of socialism. The primary difference between the two is that while many socialists sought to reform capitalism democratically via regulation, communists believed that revolution was necessary in order to make this change, and blood was spilled around the world leading up to World War I as a result. Many leaders sought to set up temporary dictatorships in order to prepare infrastructure for true communism, but so far no society has made it past this stage into pure communism, and a lot of people argue that it isn't even possible. Okay, a few of the key figures within communism. Karl Marx, as I mentioned before, was a German philosopher and political theorist. He said in his 1875 critique of the Gotha program, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." And this was intended to be kind of an overview of how communism was supposed to work. Marx also believed that the proletariat or the working class would rise up and overthrow the oppressive bourgeois or ruling class, resulting in a new classless communistic society. Okay, also instrumental in the development of communist theory and practice was Friedrich Engels, a contemporary of Marx who co-authored several works and financially supported groups who furthered the spread of communism. Two other important communist leaders were Vladimir Lenin and Mao Zedong. Lenin led Russia into communism in the early 1920s and eventually developed his own version called Leninism. Mao embraced communism as a young man in the 1920s and much later, as chairman, implemented it in China in 1949. Fascism is essentially extreme nationalism enforced by radical authoritarian government. Fascism, as we know it today, began to take shape in Italy in the 1880s, and it was popularized by Mussolini during World War I. Early fascist thinkers were inspired by the Spartans' ideals of racial purity and rule by the elite few. They believed their philosophy to be the ideological successor to the Roman Empire, and perhaps also the natural successor since they were Italian. Fascists positioned themselves as politically opposed to Marxism, anarchism, which was another influential thought wave of the time, and liberalism, such as that which emerged from the French Revolution. Fascism was a rejection of individualism and rationalism, and instead it put forward an ethos of collectivism, youth, valor, masculinity. The nation was considered the highest good, and a man's value was primarily found in belonging to and conquering on behalf of the great nation state. War was thought to be a necessity. Formally, the fascists considered themselves to be neither capitalist nor socialist, but a third option. However, Hitler's Nazi Party, one of the most conspicuous examples of fascism, shortened their name from National Socialists. So, in calling themselves so, they basically set themselves against the communists as the opposite end of the socialist spectrum. Giovanni Gentile called himself the philosopher of fascism. He ghostwrote A Doctrine of Fascism in 1930 for Benito Mussolini. Interestingly, Marx and the communists were among his influences. He admired Marx's unity of thought and system building, but he disagreed with the idea of class struggle. Benito Mussolini was originally a socialist, but influenced by Gentile, he eventually denounced the Italian Socialist Party in favor of what he called revolutionary nationalism. He was able to test out his theories as Prime Minister of Italy from 1922 to 1945. He was nicknamed Il Duce, or the Chief, and he ruled with total authority.
So now we're going to start in more of a chronological storyline, starting in about 1870, going into the pre-World War II era. We'll start with this first part with the German Empire. It was created in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. To truly understand the German Empire, you have to go a little bit further back. After the death of Frederick the Great, who was probably the greatest hero in German history, very similar to like a George Washington figure for the United States, we have the Napoleonic era in the French Revolution. It was a very bloody time for Europe, a lot of wars, and is a very difficult time specifically for Prussia, which was the forerunner of the German Empire. They lost a couple important battles in 1806, and most of that time they were subservient to Napoleon and the French, which after Napoleon's demise at Waterloo in 1815, many of their leaders, especially military leaders, went back to the drawing board and tried to figure out how to create a better system for the German army. Some of those names were Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, von Moltke, and these leaders created what is now known as the Army General Staff. It brought much more of an academic or a war gaming attitude towards war, which is much more thought out, a lot more war plans created, and it was very successful. In the 1860s, Germany won a couple of wars in Europe against Austria and Denmark, and then in 1870, they won the Franco-Prussian War, and it led to Prussia, which was the German forerunner, declaring the German Empire as the leader of that empire. They proclaimed the Kaiser, which is actually the German word for Caesar. So, doesn't that take you back to the Roman Empire? And they declared the empire in, you can see in this picture, at the Palace of Versailles, which would be like today, maybe Vladimir Putin declaring the Russian Empire in the White House or the Capitol building. It was really rubbing France's nose in their defeat. It ended the reign of Napoleon III, And Germany annexed Alsace-Lorraine, which was a very important region for France. It also created the 5 European power balance with Great Britain, Russia, Hungarian Empire, the French Third Republic, and Germany. The declaration of the German Empire also made Germany the most powerful land army in Europe overnight, and also one of the most powerful empires in the world overnight, which must have been unnerving for a lot of other European powers. And it ushered in an era in Europe where there was a lot of colonialization of Africa, the Pacific Islands, and in Asia. And there's a lot of jockeying for power, intrigue, spies, political, events during the next 50 years leading up to World War I. Next, we'll talk about why socialism was important to the pre-World War I era. One of the biggest reasons was the dramatic cultural shift from tiny farming communities to a city community in many nations. In my own hometown of Elgin, Elgin used to be one of the biggest cities in all of Illinois, even bigger than Chicago. But then in the 1830s and 1840s, Chicago went from being a very small town on Lake Michigan to one of the bigger cities in the country. And much of that was due to changes in the economy. And this has to do with technological advances in farming and the consequences of an industrial revolution. What that means specifically is there's a lot of technological advances in the way that farming was done, whereas before it was the technology was designed such that a single farmer, maybe with a couple helpers, maybe his sons and daughters, could farm a couple acres and provide for himself and his family and have a little bit to sell at market. Whereas in the 1880s, 1890s, you have a horse-drawn combine used for the first time. You have commercial fertilizer. Agriculture in general becoming much more mechanized. You have technology increasing the way that food, grains specifically, can be stored in silos. And all of these advances allowed maybe a wealthy farmer to hire more hands using this new technology or storage philosophies to produce a lot of grain all at once and then sell it at market. So the family farmer was less and less able to keep up with those kinds of advances, and therefore the money that they might make from the little bit of food left over after they had provided for themselves just didn't go as far. So you have a lot of farmers moving to cities and looking for work. And at the same time, you have the Industrial Revolution. You see a lot of factories, like Chicago specifically. There's a lot of factories going up in the northeast or northwest part of Indiana and Chicago. And this was happening all over the world. Because of this influx of a lot of labor, you see factory owners requiring men to work sometimes 12-hour days, 6 days a week at rock bottom prices where they could barely survive and provide for their families. And on the other side, you see unions popping up and strikes, that sort of thing. It led to a feeling of powerlessness on the side of the people, which in return, when people feel powerless, they generally try to find ways to fight back, hence the strikes. And it led to a lot of rough times, I guess is one way to put it. William McKinley in the United States was assassinated during this era. The Austrian Empress Elizabeth of Austria, and she was the wife of Franz Joseph I of Austria. She was assassinated by an angry socialist. We also have the French president. It was President Francois Carnot was assassinated in 1894. There was a lot of assassinations and political warfare in Spain between anarchists and socialists. And it was just generally a very, very difficult time for the world as the world adjusted to these, significant changes. Another difficult time for the world was just in the ascension of Germany to being great power. It led to a lot of ill feelings in Germany, which was kind of the birthplace of socialism. The Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, was there were many, many attempts on his life, as socialists were unhappy with the way society was going. They felt like the people needed more power. And over time, in each of these countries, the people did gain more power with this unrest. But leading up to World War I, Germany, Austria, Russia, they were all ruled by absolute monarchs. And while the people did maintain a very small amount of power, it was very insignificant. If the monarch wanted to do something, they did it. So now we get to World War I. The picture you see there is the nephew of the Empress of Austria. His name is Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the nephew of Franz Joseph of Austria. And he played the role very similar to Prince Charles of England. And he was in many ways the face of the empire to many people, as Emperor Franz Joseph was very old at this point. He was soon to be the emperor himself. And he, unlike Prince Charles of England, was going to have very real power. So the story of the assassination, I'll briefly go over it. He was going on a tour. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire was very, very divided at this point. There were 16 different official languages at the time. Many of these people wanted to realize their own nationalities. You've got Yugoslavia, Serbia among the leaders that were just very unhappy. So a Serb nationalist, his name is Gavrilo Princip, and it's said to be about 20 others, although it's hard to prove that. When the Archduke came to visit Sarajevo, just to see the town, just to visit, his parade route was printed in the newspapers. And this group of 20 assassins came out to the parade. It was actually very similar to the JFK assassination, if you're familiar with that. Except in this case, they attempted one time, and something like a hand grenade. And the Archduke ducked out of the way. The grenade hurt some other people. But a little bit later in the day, Gavrilo Princip was able to take a couple shots at the Archduke and his wife, and both of them were shortly afterward declared dead. As you can imagine, this created a very bad feeling in Austria. They made a lot of demands on Serbia, which no sovereign nation could agree with. But Serbia had an alliance with a very powerful neighbor. At this point, it was with the Empire of Russia. The Empire of Russia and Tsar Nicholas, the absolute ruler there, backed Serbia up. And they said, if there's going to be war, between Austria and Serbia will go to war on Serbia's side. Now, Austria also had a friend in this conflict, and that was the German Empire. They also had an alliance with Italy, and Russia had an alliance with France. So if the Germans and Austrians went to war with Serbia and Russia, France would also come in on the side of Russia, and it just became very, very complex. Russia, if they went to war and France with them, they also had a handshake deal with the English, which was tentative at best, but it was based on the idea that if the Germans invaded Belgium on their way to France, the English would come in on the side of the French. So it's a very complex web of alliances, which gets even more complicated by the military doctrines of the day. At this point, you don't have any tanks. Most of these armies in 1914 were powered by the speed of a marching man or a horse. Very similar to the American Civil War at the beginning. And that phrase you see, the quote you see up there, "Get there firstest with the mostest," is actually from an American Civil War general named Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was a very successful cavalry commander. And his philosophy was just that if you get there firstest with the mostest, you're probably going to win. So what he generally did is tried to make his troops go as fast as possible, get to the battlefield first, overwhelm the enemy, and move on. That was the philosophy of all the major powers in this conflict. And so with this complex web of alliances, the idea was that you wanted to mobilize your army first, get to the battlefield, fight on enemy territory, and as much as possible, if you have the overwhelming numbers, you would win. So once the Archduke was assassinated, there was a lot of quick diplomacy, a lot of tentative days, late nights, telegraphs going back and forth with the various diplomats trying to figure out if they were going to have war or not, because whoever went to war first and pulled the switch for mobilization, everybody had to go to war. So it was very tentative days in July and August of 1914. At this point, we're going to jump ahead a little bit to 1917. Although World War I has a lot of interesting storylines, we're going to just stick to a couple as it applies to our story. The gentleman in the middle there you see is Arthur Balfour, who had already, at this point in his career, he had already been prime minister, and he was the foreign minister of England. The man on the right you see there is Chaim Weizmann, who was a chemist, very, very successful inventor, and also the man who took over for Theodor Herzl as a leader among the Zionists in England. And then the document you see on the left side there, that is the Balfour Declaration. Now, we have to go back in the story just a little bit to 1915, when another Zionist, Jewish philosopher Hermann Cohen, he went to the United States to ask the Jewish leaders there in New York to try and persuade the U.S. government to enter the war on Germany's side. Now, with the knowledge we have about how World War II went and the Holocaust, it is very difficult to imagine that a Jewish philosopher would go to New York saying that the Germans are the right side in this war. But we have to imagine how people in that day would think, because they didn't know there was a Holocaust coming. And at this point in world history, the two places where Jews had been most welcome was the United Kingdom, or the British Empire, and the German Empire. Kaiser Wilhelm had made a visit to Jerusalem not too long before, and he had been working with Zionists to try to find a national home for the Jews, as had the English. But at this point, the English were seen as behind the Germans as far as friendship. There were many families in Germany that had very successful businesses and banks, like the Oppenheimer family. And that Germany was seen as friendly to Jews at this point. So obviously the United States did not come in on the side of Germany in 1915, but at one point Chaim Weizmann was able to convince the English foreign minister Arthur Balfour to create this declaration. It was a letter to Walter Rothschild. Now we should talk about what this declaration is and what it is not. And actually, it should be said that the British had been willing to give what is now Uganda to the Zionists as a homeland. They would see it as a British colony, but they would give the Jewish immigrants autonomy over themselves. They could create their own homeland. They could rule it with their own religious rules and create a Jewish state in Uganda. But when asked about it, Chaim Weizmann told Arthur Balfour, well, you wouldn't go live in Saskatchewan as the British Empire, would you? And Balfour replied, no, but we've been living in London for centuries. To this, Weizmann replied, well, we've been living in Jerusalem since London was a marsh. And that kind of drove the idea home that, while it was wonderful that England was willing to give the Zionists Uganda, that wasn't their home. Even if it was, 100 miles away from modern-day Israel, it still wasn't home. Home was Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Megiddo and Haifa and Hebron. That was their home, and no other home would quite do. So when Arthur Balfour makes this declaration to Walter Rothschild, declaring that England is willing to make a national home for the Jews, he was doing it, and it was very, very generous of the British to do it, but he was also giving something away that was not his. The Turkish Empire, or the Ottoman Empire at this time, controlled what is now modern-day Israel. And the idea was that if the Jewish Zionists would come in on the side, and in this case, many of them are bankers, and so there is a benefit for the Royal British Crown if the Zionists come in on the side of the English. And the idea is that if they will loan money to the British Crown, that in the event of an Allied victory, the Jews will receive a national homeland in Palestine. It's a very interesting declaration. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about it, but that is, I guess, the rough estimate of it. A few thousand miles away, in Russia, we have also very many significant events going on as well in 1917. Here in the middle, you see Vladimir Lenin. He's a very instrumental socialist, and he was responsible for the October Revolution in Russia. Now, it is worth noting one of the reasons why the communist or Bolshevik revolution worked in Russia was due to the fact that Russia was one of the most conservative, or if you want to call it backwards, societies on the earth at that time, or at least in the modern world. There were a whole lot of people that lived in Russia, and they were ruled by one man, essentially. There was an uprising in 1905, but it was quickly repressed. The emperor, Tsar Nicholas, viewed himself as a divine appointee of God to rule Russia, and he did not want to share that power. He did give a little power to the People's Duma. It might be similar to the U.S. Congress or the British Parliament, but they didn't carry much power at all, and they didn't have the power to change the way that the government was run or how the people were treated or workers' rights, anything like that. In the course of the war, and the war was directed truly by that one family, Tsar Nicholas, there was an interesting development in the royal family, and that was by an advisor who is something like a cult leader or a monk, and his name was Rasputin. If you have watched the Disney movie called Anastasia, there is the bad guy in the movie, quote unquote, is named Rasputin, and he is based on a real character. He's seen as very demonic in the movie, and I think that's how a lot of Russians saw this character. He was very wild. He was a heavy drinker and a womanizer, but the royal family believed that he had the power to heal their son, who was the heir to the throne. Anytime he would get sick, Rasputin would either pray for him or give him some sort of herbal medicine, and the boy would get well. Anytime Rasputin was out of favor and would go away, the boy would eventually get worse, and his illnesses would get worse, and then they would call Rasputin back, and the boy would get better. Because of his wild living, the people in Russia did not like Rasputin. They thought he had a bad control over the royal family, and with an absolute monarch, if somebody controls his ear, that person essentially can steer the empire. So as long as Rasputin was in power, the royal family was viewed very badly by the public. And when the war started going against Russia, Rasputin was viewed especially much poorer by the population at large. This led to, in 1817, a workers' movement where they would march in the streets of Petrograd or St. Petersburg and go on strike. This led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas, and he and his family were eventually assassinated. The State Duma took over control of the country. They formed a provisional government, but it was all very messy. It was not very successful. And the Germans then, the German Empire, saw an opening. They contacted Vladimir Lenin, and they made an agreement with him to get him into Russia if he would make peace, if he was able to take over the country. At the time, Lenin was living in Switzerland, so the Germans put him on the train that you see there in the picture, along with 32 other people, and they sealed the train carriage as it was passing through German territory. And the reason for that was that the Germans feared the type of uprising that was going on in Russia, and they were afraid that if Lenin had a chance to speak to any German people, it would create a socialist uprising in Germany at that time. And at this point, the war had been going into its third year, and it was creating hardships all over the country. Lenin famously remarked that as he was passing through Germany, he did not see one man of military age. And he knew for that reason that the war was almost over. Germany was running out of men to fight. So, and again, we are brushing over a lot of details here, but Lenin arrived in Petrograd, and he immediately got to work speaking to small groups. And in October, he led the Soviet revolution there. It's interesting to note also that Leon Trotsky, at that point, was in Russia, and he was also leading the Bolshevik Party. Lenin is actually a really interesting guy. I think many times we have in America specifically, we view Russia as the Joseph Stalin Russia, and he was he was an iron-fisted totalitarian. Lenin was not quite that guy. He was much more peaceful, and in fact, before he died in 1924, he specifically told all of his advisors, "I don't care who rules after me, but don't let it be him," meaning Joseph Stalin, because he knew that Stalin was too violent. He was too much of a dictator type, and we see in history that his words were very truthful. So after the October Revolution, there was a treaty between Russia, now led by Vladimir Lenin, and the German Empire. It's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And it was very favorable to Germany because the Russian Republic now, the Soviet Union, wanted a quick end to the war because they believed they were internationalists. Although many of those communists, Bolsheviks, were Russian, they did not believe that they were a Russian group. They believed that the entire working class of the world would join hands together and create a new world order. That sounds very conspiratorial, but that's how they viewed it. They viewed that people everywhere wanted to have a say in their own livelihood, their self-determination. So they wanted a quick end to the war because they believed that socialism and communism would spread to the German Empire, and that there would be a similar revolution in each of the major modern countries at the time. The way that it affected the rest of the war was that now Germany had half of its army to go fight the French and the British on the traditional World War I as we know it, and on the Western Front. At this point, the Germans send part of their army to Italy. They fight a battle there called Caporetto, and they essentially knock Italy out of the war. At this point in the war, the United States is about to join as well, and the Germans see an opportunity to end the war. Where at the beginning of 1918, Germany was undefeated, and there had only been 2 battles inside of Germany, and both of them had been resounding victories for the Germans. They had mostly been fighting in enemy territory, and they had been mostly successful. They believed they could end the war with a couple big battles on the Western Front before the United States was able to bring their soldiers to France. This battle is called Operation Michael, and the Germans, in a series of enormous battles, attacked the French and British. They got very close to winning the war. The British described it as hanging on by their fingernails, but eventually the German power just ran out. They were exhausted. A lot of times they ran out of supplies. And then you have the American soldiers beginning to come onto the battlefields. And at this point, Germany is not defeated, but they know they can no longer win. And they try to go to the peace table. This is, in America, what we know as Veterans Day, 11/11, and there is a ceasefire, and the idea that now both sides will make peace and there will be an end to the war. What you see, the building there is the Palace of Versailles again, and the irony was not lost on the Germans that the place where they had declared the German Empire was the place where the treaty was going to be signed. There was a lot of, I guess revenge would be the right word, on the side of the French. They wanted to stick it to the Germans. The American delegation, led by Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, they wanted to create a good feeling after the terrible war, and he wasn't able to accomplish that. The Americans and the English wanted to create a better world, whereas the French had mostly they wanted reparations for the war. They wanted to create an environment where Germany became weak and the French would be the stronger neighbor. They inflicted a very heavy war indemnity on the Germans. At the time, it was 132 billion marks, or in US dollars today, it was $442 billion, which was just phenomenal. British economist John Maynard Keynes, who is widely regarded as one of the greatest economists of all time, was at the peace conference, and he predicted that it was too harsh. He called it a Carthaginian peace, which, if you're familiar with the Carthaginian Roman wars, the idea is that it will be counterproductive, that this will just cause bitterness. Now, there were also some French that believed it was too lenient. The Generalissimo of the Allied armies, the commander-in-chief, his name was General Ferdinand Foch. When he saw the final peace treaty, he said, "This isn't peace, this is a 20-year truce." And he was angry because he thought that the Germans should suffer more because they believed that France had won the war, and Germany should be required to be weakened economically and militarily for it. Regardless, the Germans, when they realized what they were going to be forced to sign, they protested vigorously. At this point, the Allies told them, well, if you want to go back to war, you can. But the Germans at this point had disbanded their army. Kaiser Wilhelm had already abdicated. They were in a state of chaos, and they were forced to sign this peace treaty. But it led to a lot of bitterness. In many war veterans, like Adolf Hitler, they had fought many times for 2, 3, 4 years. They had seen many of their friends die. They had seen their economy weakened. And they believed that they were still undefeated in battle because the war had never really crossed into German lands. It had always been in France. The only 2 times it had crossed over into Germany, the Germans had soundly defeated the Russians. And they felt that although they could not win, they had not lost the war. They also believed that the ruling class had stabbed them in the back. And regardless of the truth of it, they believed that the Jewish leaders had gained from the war. The bankers, the businessmen had gained from the war, and they believed that the Jewish leaders had been partly responsible for why Germany lost the war. And that led to the stab in the back theory, where a lot of former German soldiers became very, very angry. A lot of Hitler's inner circle would be these type of leaders. Hermann Göring, who was a famous fighter pilot in the war, he was famously very, very outspoken about his views on how Germany was stabbed in the back by Jewish business leaders and by Allied leaders and some German leaders as well. Now we'll cover some of what was going on in Jewish communities during this era. The Jewish communities were somewhat divided into three camps during this era. And it seems very similar to the way that Western culture at this time, which had been mostly growing on the same path that it had been for about 500 years, the Jewish cultures in Europe had been mostly along a linear path for about 500 years. They had experienced persecution, but also in some countries, very prosperous times, specifically in Germany and England. But the Jewish community seemed between about 1820 and 1930 to be split into three separate camps. You had the Zionists led by Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann and others, and they were avidly pushing for a Jewish homeland in Israel. They were very aggressive. They had a Zionist Congress that they held many times. You also have these socialist Jews with the socialist leaning, and most of the time, this camp was driven by the idea that they didn't want to be outsiders anymore, or if you want to call it alienation fatigue. They hated living in the ghettos. And by ghetto, what I mean is many times in European countries, they would set aside a very specific part of a city for the Jews, and it would, many times it was too small. Many times there was a lot of poverty there, and our modern day skyscrapers are designed similarly to the way that these communities lived, because it was a very small area and they had to build up because they could not build out. This led to a lot of Jewish families changing their names and completely giving up their Jewish heritage. Then you also had the traditionalists, and these were very religious Jews, and they did not feel like they wanted to go the political route as the Zionists did to create a homeland. They were very committed to their traditions. They were very committed to praying for a Messiah to rescue them, very committed to the ideas of Zionism, but not the political route that it took. They wanted to stay in their communities. They did not want to mix with the people in the lands that they were. They wanted to just pray and wait for the Messiah to rescue them. So one of the reasons why one of these three camps was driven to socialism was that it promised equality for workers based on humanity, not on nationality or race. The gentleman you see in this picture here is Walter Rathenau. He was a leader in Germany in the 1920s, and he was one of a class in Germany. He was a socialist politician. He was from a very wealthy family, and he was assassinated in the 1920s because he was perceived as having been a war profiteer. And this goes back to the idea that that the German army or the German people were stabbed in the back by some of their leaders. Rathenau believed that Germany should go the route of becoming a socialist republic that would be a safe place for people of all races, all religions, and he wanted to create an environment where his people, the Jews, could live safely and prosper. But this, especially by conservative nationalists, it was perceived as that he was succeeding where the German Empire had failed. And they didn't like that because they also believed, again, that he had been a profiteer on the war. And whereas the German people had suffered, this Jewish politician, businessman, had been successful. The other picture that you see here is Lev Davidovich Bronstein, but many people know him by the name Leon Trotsky. He was a Jew from a very wealthy family in Ukraine. They were farmers, and they were very wealthy. But Leon Trotsky didn't like the stigma of being Jewish. So he changed his name to something that would be more recognizable as Russian. He did not grow up believing the traditional Jewish faith or religion, and he wanted to see his people be welcomed into the society that they were part of in Russia. He was a very successful politician. He was part of the October Revolution. He was actually the chosen successor to Vladimir Lenin, and it makes you wonder how the world might have been different had he been the ultimate successor instead of Joseph Stalin. But he was exiled after Lenin's death. He went to Mexico City, where he was assassinated by some of Stalin's men in 1925. Now we'll cover some of the internal upheaval that Germany experienced following the World War. What you see right here is the Spartacus uprising of January 1919. Near the end of the war and the following couple of years, Germany had a lot of upheaval. You have a lot of I told you so socialists saying, we should never have followed an empire. We should have never followed, the conservative capitalists that followed the German Kaiser. And you also have a lot of what ended up becoming the Nazi Party, and these are primarily former soldiers. They are the conservative, tough guys who believe that Germany should be strong again, and they believe that socialism would end up making Germany weak. They believed that in a lot of cases, the socialists were in a league with Jewish business leaders and also in a league with enemies of Germany from outside of the country. So these uprisings, there was one even before the end of the war where the socialist organizers took over parts of Berlin and other countries. It was, there were street battles, and that was one other reason why the Nazi Party viewed socialists so antagonistically. The German brown shirts, on the other hand, they were the predecessor to the Nazi Party or the SS. They were essentially an organized street gang. There were very obviously, left over from the World War. There was a lot of weapons, ammunition, and for a while it seemed like Germany would get out of control. This is the era that you start seeing Hitler and some of his friends start to gain power. Hitler was an incredible speaker, and when he spoke about Germany becoming strong again, it appealed to a lot of the former soldiers who were angry. They felt like the Germany that they knew should be strong, and they felt like it had been sold out, and now they felt like the socialists were going to keep Germany weak. They were going to allow Germany to, be trampled on by its neighbors. And so these street battles would go on for years until eventually the Nazi Party took over. And these street battles between, again, the socialists and the German brown shirts. It was in one of these battles that Hitler's number two, Hermann Göring, who would end up commanding the German Air Force, was injured, and he ended up becoming a drug addict due to the painkillers he had to take from all the injuries. Hitler himself spent a number of months in jail after one of these street battles. He narrowly avoided the death penalty for his trouble, but that's where he wrote his famous book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. In the aftermath of World War I, the German economy struggled, and to this day there are a lot of studies based on the incredible difficult time that the German people went through in the immediate aftermath of World War I. Part of this was just due to the war. Germany had been a very, very robust economy going into the war, but they required trade to be very successful. And in the immediate beginning of the World War, the English Navy, which was the most powerful navy in the world, had immediately blockaded Germany. So Germany was left with what it could produce. And they were not able to produce enough food for their army and for their civilians. So they had what they called a turnip winter in the winter of 1916 to 1917. And it didn't get much better until the end of the naval blockade in June 1919. The struggles continued for a while after that. One of the issues also was going to be the reparations from the World War, as we mentioned earlier. This cartoon is kind of an explanation of how the German people felt about it. One of the ways that the German leadership tried to deal with this problem was to print more money. And if you're familiar with what happened with Robert Mugabe's attempt to pay his soldiers in Zimbabwe, you'll understand kind of what the German people were going through. In Zimbabwe, the people sometimes were being paid with $100 billion notes, and it wasn't even worth the paper that it was printed on. The same was true in Germany. Because of the hyperinflation, sometimes workers would be paid 3 times a day, maybe at breakfast, at lunch, and at dinner, and they would have their wives come and take the money and go buy anything that they could buy at the stores, because by the next time their husband was paid, the money would be worth so much less in terms of buying power that it wouldn't even be worth it. So with these kinds of issues and having to repay back the 132 billion marks, the economy just suffered. And you can imagine, in the middle of these street battles, in the middle of the political uncertainty, the country having to tax so much to pay back the war indemnity, it was just a very difficult time for the German people. This leads us to one of the more fascinating characters I've ever heard of. His name is Samuel Untermyer. He was a lawyer in New York during this time period. He was Jewish by birth, And he helped found the non-sectarian Anti-Nazi League to promote an economic boycott of Nazi Germany. You can see in the newspaper there and the flyer, they were very realistic in the ways that they could impact the situation in Germany. Because remember, before this time, Germany had been a very welcoming place to the Jewish communities. I think it says something that many of the famous scientists that we have during this period were from Germany, and they were Jewish. One of the most famous banking families of all time, the Rothschild family, had a very, very big presence in Frankfurt. The Oppenheimer family was very influential in banking in Germany. There were also media men, there were shipping magnates that were all Jewish. And during this time period, as the Nazis gained power, whether real or supposed, their understanding that these socialists and the Jewish community had been responsible for the defeat in World War I, led to a lot of the beginnings of persecution. And I think it is interesting to note that at the Zionist Congress, Samuel Untermyer, who was from New York, he proposed this ban, and very shortly after, the German delegation came to him and said, please do not do this, because it will exacerbate what is already a difficult situation in Germany for the Jews. And although he didn't immediately listen, Untermyer soon afterwards tried to retrace his steps and change the ban, or to at least undo it. But it seems like the damage was already done at that point. Now, what this ban did is it meant that any goods that were created in Germany could not be sold or transported by anyone who agreed with the ban. And that included a lot of people. So what that meant is that the world over, anyone who was against the Nazis stopped selling German goods. And that led to an even worse depression in Germany than had already been going on. And if you'll remember, in 1929, most of the world, and especially in the United States, you enter into the Great Depression as we know it. It also struck Germany, but it was made much worse after this economic ban. And it led, as you can imagine, to Hitler and the Nazi Party getting a feeling of the world is against us, and a feeling of maybe that the United States is ruled by a Jewish culture and they are against us. They already believed that the Bolshevik-led communists in Russia were against them, and they already believed that the British Empire was against them. And I think it's important to understand, even though it's impossible to go back and know everybody's ideology or what they believed, or what we can't know what they knew for certain, but this is how the people in that era viewed each other. And I think it's important to know that as we view this incredibly difficult time in human history, and especially for the Jewish people, as God's chosen people, they were experiencing a difficult time, and this economic ban made life in Germany for the Jewish community just terrible. You start seeing the Star of David being forced on any person of Jewish descent at this time. There's also a mass exodus of people who had the ability to leave Germany at this time, especially of Jewish descent. You see a mass exodus. And on the other side, you also see people who are very tied to Germany and German values, German nationalists. You see them all going back to Germany to kind of experience these difficult times together, to be with family during these difficult times. It was, in America, we see the Great Depression as one of the most difficult times in our history. But for Germany, it was also a very difficult time, not to mention the fact that they had a totalitarian government who was able to really rule every facet of life. And it's also worth saying that there were a lot of Germans in Germany at the time who did not believe the Nazi philosophies, even though there were also some that did not believe that. So this is just a very, very difficult time. With that, we come to the very end of our chronological story here, at the introduction to World War II. Hitler believed in a philosophy called Lebensraum, which was essentially elbow room. After World War I, the German people had been forced to give up multiple tracts of land to, some of them became other countries, like Czechoslovakia, Poland, which had not been a nation at the beginning of World War I, became a nation, and it carved up parts of Germany to the point where, like, Germany had a port called Danzig that was separated from the rest of Germany by Poland. Not all of Germany actually touched. I mean, it would be like if Alaska, had been connected to Washington State and Idaho and Montana, and then all of a sudden during a peace treaty, Canada was able to take the land in between Alaska and Montana. So, that was one of the many grievances for the Nazi Party that they wanted to rectify through violence or domination, intimidation. So one of their first moves was to take Sudetenland, which was just right on their border. They used as an excuse that they thought German people should be ruled by a German government, and they made an agreement with Great Britain and France, where they said, if you let us take that, we won't take anything else. But a few months later, they marched into Vienna. They also took parts of Czechoslovakia, and they just started eating up territory after territory. Eventually, the English and French said, all right, if you do anything else, we're going to declare war. And then this picture is of a German tank group going into battle in Poland on September 1st, 1939. That was the outbreak in Europe of World War II. Now, many people question, was Hitler crazy? How did he think that a country like Germany could fight Russia and France and England and the United States and have any hope of coming out on top? And I think it's important to understand his philosophy, because there have been many books written about, how crazy Hitler was, how silly his war plans were, and why did he invade Russia? Why did he declare war on America when the Americans had no grievance against Germany? After Pearl Harbor, they were going to go to war with Japan, but they were not necessarily going to go to war with Germany. And I think it's important to understand Germany, due to all the things that we've looked at here in this video. They believed that the world, specifically the United States, which has a very large Jewish community in New York, which is why even today the Israeli prime minister, when he's coming to visit America, he flies into New York to visit with the Jewish community there. There's a very powerful community there of Jewish people, and also the socialists, which Hitler viewed as an arm of the Jewish community. They believed that the world was against them. They had that victim mentality, if you want to call it that, where they believed that the whole world was out to get them. And through some of his writings, and this is my opinion, not necessarily history, and I think that should be said, but there's a lot of, it seems to me, reading between the lines, that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party believed that the world was out to get them, and therefore they should strike first. We see that with the surprise attack on June 22nd of 1941, when they launched 4 million German and Allied soldiers into Russia. And, this great big assault, they believed that they were fighting in self-defense, and they were fighting for the German people's existence. They believed that when they declared war on the United States, they believed that the American people, along with the Jewish community in America, was coming to get them. And that victim mentality led them to lash out at Jews living in their own country. And to some extent, if you could view the way that the Jewish people living in Germany assisted, it's been said that around 100,000 Jewish German soldiers died in service of the empire in World War I. How different could World War II have been, or just, Germany as a whole, if the Nazis had not persecuted the Jewish people, if they had treated them like regular citizens. It's a very interesting thought to consider. Or if instead of declaring war on Russia, if they had allowed peace with Russia. It's very interesting thoughts to consider. But in closing, this time period of the formation of the German Empire in 1870 to the beginning of World War II is a kind of like a whiplash time. If you imagine someone who was born in 1870, they could have lived through all of these things, the rise of the German Empire, then the fall, and then experience Nazi Germany and all the difficulties for, really any human living in Germany at that time, and definitely other places such as Eastern Europe or France. You can see the forces of Zionism drawing the Jewish people back to their homeland. And even though it won't truly happen until after World War II, you can see through all of this suffering that, humans throughout the world experienced during this time frame. I believe that there was a greater story going on, and that is that the people of Israel were being drawn back to their homeland that had been under, Muslim rule for hundreds of years at that point. There wasn't a large Jewish community there. And through all these various terrible, heartbreaking experiences, you see the Jewish people ready to go back to the homeland and create a new life there. It's just objectively, it's a very remarkable experience to watch, but it's also, when you consider, the prophecies in the Bible, it is just the pain and the suffering, but also the homeland being birthed is just it's a phenomenal story. I love stories, and this has to be one of the most electric stories, and also painful and just very fascinating stories in human history. With that, we will say thank you for going through this story with us. We enjoyed immensely putting it together and researching and finding the dates and facts and interesting people, most of which wasn't even able to make it into the video. We hope you enjoyed as much as we did.